Britain's most famous cryptid, one of its most famous hoaxes, and incredible shape-shifting otters. I'm Matt, and this is the Spectred Isle. Welcome to the Spectred Isle, a channel dedicated to the myths, mysteries and malcontents that inhabit these great isles of Britain. As someone fascinated by the myths and legends of the British Isles, but put off by the amounts of bits and pieces scattered around the internet, libraries and bookshops when I'm looking for specific things, I set up this channel to collate all of those stories and legends that inspire me into one place, in the hopes that anyone who shares my passion can find what they're looking for here. I intend to do several different series on the channel, focusing on topics like hauntings, cryptids, legendary figures, unexplained mysteries, disappearances, and anything that lends itself to the spooky side of history. And to kick off, I thought, let's cover one of the most famous legends in the English-speaking world, the Loch Ness Monster. The Loch Ness Monster, otherwise known as Nessie, is one of the most well-known and beloved cryptids ever, and brings a wealth of tourism to the local area, not just by the Brits, but from across the globe. Generally, the monster is described as being grey-brown, sometimes green, with a long neck and a head about the size of a rugby ball that it pokes out of the water. It also has humps that protrude from the water behind it like a sea serpent, and has flippers for limbs. Nessie is so synonymous with the world of cryptids that it has lit up the hearts and imaginations of the locals, as well as visiting would-be spotters. You'd be hard pressed to visit any gift shop in the surrounding area and not see Nessie themed items adorning the walls and shelves, especially not if you went to the Loch Ness Nessie shop on the A82. The only thing you are more likely to see in a Scottish gift shop than a Nessie themed section is an I'm Brew themed section. The name wasn't given until a news report in the Inverness Courier in 1933, but allegedly sightings of a marine creature in those parts go back as far as the 6th century. The earliest reported sighting of a sea monster in the area comes from the biography of the Irish monk and missionary Saint Columba, who is credited with spreading the message of Christianity to the clans of Scotland, at the time split into several territories such as Pitland and Dalriata. His biography, written by the abbot Adomman, a man born about 30 years after Columba died, is credited with being the best surviving account of not just Columba's life, but the life and culture of the clans of the time period, particularly the Picts. According to this biography, Columba and his companions witnessed a man being buried on the banks of the River Ness, which is actually separated from the loch by another loch, Loch Dochfor. The locals doing the burying explained that the man had been out for a swim in the river when he was beset by a water beast that viciously attacked him before dragging him under the water, while the residents tried to row out to rescue him. Columba, stand-up guy that he was, told one of his companions to swim to the opposite shore in an attempt to lure the beast out. When the beast showed up to attack the man, Columba, still safely on the shore, made a cross sign with his fingers and shouted at the beast to go no further, do not touch the man, go back at once. The beast stopped, apparently as though being caught and dragged backwards by ropes, and swam off. Naturally, Columba was praised for his bravery, no word as to whether the guy that actually risked his life in the river was similarly praised, and the local Picts were all astounded by the power of the Christian word and went on to be good Christians. I do jest with that last comment, but it has to be said that this was a biography about Columba, written by the abbot of a monastery founded by Columba, during a period where Pictish worship of the Christian god was still relatively new, and stories of miracles were a great way of cementing someone's faith. Obviously, one of the issues people have with this story is that it's set in the River Ness rather than the loch, but I'll go into that later. There's a lot of consensus that the loch just really isn't big enough to support a family of whatever creature Nessie is for such a sustained amount of time. However, as many waterways as there are on the surface of the world, underground there are so many more. What's to say the Nessie family actually lives in some hitherto undiscovered underground lake large enough to accommodate them, and they use the river to get to the loch for a hunt, or a bit of fresh air, or to mess with gullible tourists. There's also another story in Columba's biography where he was travelling around the Isle of Skye and encounters a giant boar, does the exact same thing with the cross sign and the go no further speech, and it too was struck down by his holy words. So the river monster story isn't the only one where he's credited with deterring beasts through the power of the Lord. Now, there aren't any official sightings of a monster in the loch until the 20th century. But that being said, in various articles and publications around the 1930s, when Nessie fever truly kicked off, there were mentions of a variety of alleged sightings throughout history. Many of these came from one single letter written to a local newspaper by a man called D. Murray Rose, who failed to provide any citations or his address, and he closed off the letter by saying actually he thinks the monster is a shark because he claims sharks have been showing up in Loch Ness for years. So, if you hear stories about the locals refusing to eat fish from the loch and saying it's taboo, or accounts about a monster from soldiers and explorers in the early modern period, or even the historian Dio Cassius writing about ancient Rome and claiming that there are mentions of the Loch Monster there, it's all made up by this one guy. There was one account of a man in the 1960s who claims he saw a Neolithic pagan carving found in the nearby area that depicted a sea serpent, which it absolutely did, but this was one of several symbols used by the ancient Picts in carvings and has been found in many other places than just Loch Ness. In fact, the Loch Ness Mystery blog even looked at sites these carvings were found against lochs with monster stories, and there is pretty much no correlation between the two at all. That being said, maybe the monster inspired the symbol, we'll never know. There are multitudes of ancient myths about sea monsters and serpents in the British Isles. The Store Worm, the Marule, Kirian Croin, Bregdy, Swileach, Rostron Sea Serpent, the Thanet Sea Monster, the Barmouth Sea Serpent, the Humber Monster, many of which bear some kind of resemblance to Nessie. So while modern skeptics debunk the idea that the monster is just another superstition, if individual clans and tribes from all over the place, all unbeknownst to each other, have somehow come up with the exact same myths, maybe there is some truth to it. The next two alleged sightings were in the late 1800s, although both of them were only published in 1934, a year after the first news reporting when monster fever had the population hooked on sightings. Both reports only seem to appear in a book by ex-Royal Navy officer Rupert Gould. Gould had a fascination with cryptozoology, and due to his time spent serving on various Navy ships, with sea serpents in particular, he was an avid fan of the unexplained and even wrote 2 books about it in the late 1920s called Unexplained Facts, as well as a book specifically titled The Case for the Sea Serpent. Thus, when the 1933 news article about Nessie came out, which I will eventually talk about soon, he hopped on his motorbike, started interviewing local residents and purported witnesses of the monster for his book, The Loch Ness Monster and Others. No idea where these others come from, but it's a catchy title. One example, apparently occurring in 1871 or 1872, was by a man known as D. Mackenzie, who only told the story in a letter he wrote to Gould in 1934. He claims he saw an object in the water that he thought was potentially an upturned kayak or a log or driftwood, except that it was wriggling about and churning the water, and as he watched it, it started off slow but began to travel at increasingly faster speeds. Another was in 1888 by a mason called Alexander MacDonald, who saw a large, stubby-legged creature that he thought was a salamander coming out of the loch and onto the shore close to where he was standing. I don't know if you've ever seen a salamander, but the maximum length they can grow is about 2 meters. So while that is impressive, it doesn't really gel with the massive beast that Nessie reportedly is, unless of course it was baby Nessie. There are loads of sightings listed in Gould's book, mostly from around 1933 after it all kicked off. I mean, it covers the next sighting I'm about to talk about, and then tens of pages later is still recounting more that came after that, all within a year or so. Very few seem to have come before that news article. Take from that what you will. The next chronological sighting is really the first one that kicked it all off. The account was from a woman called Mackey and was published in the Inverness Courier on the 2nd of May 1933. Interestingly, before I go into that, I want to discuss the man who wrote the article about Aldi's sighting, a man called Alex Campbell. Campbell was a water bailiff for the Ness Fisheries Board, and the loch was his stomping ground. He grew up with stories of a water monster in the loch, though it is presumed his mother told him this story to stop him from attempting to swim in the deep freezing waters as a child. That said, in the books I read, it does appear that his family were deeply into the superstitions and stories of the Scottish Highlands, which probably explains a lot about his later behaviour. As well as being a water bailiff, Campbell was a would-be journalist, and it was he who penned the article that kicked off Nessie fever in 1933. He went on to write and contribute to articles over the next 30 years and stands as the person who has allegedly seen the monster more times than any other individual. What's funny is that several months after his article in the Courier, when the national newspapers started getting in on the trend, the first to arrive on the scene to report the monster was the Scotsman. Anonymously, Campbell told a story to the reporter of his own sighting of the monster, in which he pretended to be a former skeptic who changed his mind after seeing it. I assume because he was upset about all the skepticism the stories were facing, and he wanted to act like even the staunchest of Nessie deniers could be converted, and he described it as basically a Plesiosaur, which I will discuss in a short while. His employers, the Ness Fisheries Board, as you can imagine, were not a fan of the increased traffic and disturbances the monster stories were bringing to the loch, so obviously had an issue that Campbell, their bailiff, was promoting these stories. Now, I'm not entirely sure how they came to know it was Campbell who told this story to the Scotsman, since the report didn't name him, but he doesn't seem like the type of guy who hangs on to anonymity for very long. So it's not really a surprise that they found out. He probably bragged about it down the pub or something. Due to his employer's displeasure, Campbell then wrote another letter with the exact same story, except added to it by claiming that the light was improving all the time, and in a matter of seconds I discovered that what I took to be the monster was nothing more than a few cormorants. The thing I find funny about this is that clearly Campbell was a believer in the monster, and he was just told to say this to keep his job. But Gould quoted this letter in his book as an example of people who'll say they saw the monster because they really wanted to, but probably didn't see anything, something he coined as expectant attention, and contributed this as potential proof as to the lack of a monster. So the biggest promoter of the monster in the area ended up being documented in the first ever book about it as someone who didn't see anything and was making it all up. Naturally, he wrote several more articles over the next 30 years to try and increase his stock as the Nessie expert, presumably fuming that Gould made him out to be some kind of denier. Also, I wanted to say at this point, a lot of the information I got around these sightings and the truth behind them were not just from Gould, but also Ronald Binns' 1984 book, The Loch Ness Mystery Solved. And it is really funny seeing how much Binns is biting his tongue when he talks about some of these people. He is trying his best not to straight up call Campbell an idiot, so instead does the next best thing and dedicates an entire chapter just to discrediting him. So back to Aldi Mackey and what she claims to have seen. Apparently on the 14th of April 1933, Aldi was travelling home from Inverness with her husband and they were driving down the A82. She spotted a whale-like fish in the loch, saw what she thought was a hump in the water and exclaimed, "Stop! The beast!" A huge wave spread across the water and two black humps emerged, one slightly smaller than the other, moving in line with the wave. By the time her husband had stopped the car to have a look, it had disappeared. Interesting, Aldi did not go to the papers with the news herself. It was only when her husband casually mentioned it to Alex Campbell that Campbell decided to write about it for the Courier. It doesn't appear that Campbell ever actually spoke directly to Aldi either, he just took what her husband had said she remembered and went with it. Naturalist and Nessie expert and obvious wizard Adrian Shine went to visit Miss Mackey in the late 80s, asking her about her experience. In particular, her comment of "stop the beast" was unusual because there was a lack of any documented sightings of a beast in the loch, bearing in mind that aside from Columba's adventure, all the sightings prior to 1933 were only reported after Aldi's story had been published. Aldi was hesitant to discuss the proclamation, but eventually admitted that there was an oral tradition of a beast in the loch. But she also said people should take more water with it, an old idiom used to imply that someone may have had a few too many drinks. Anyway, after the report of Aldi's sighting and the national press getting in on the action, a string of sightings and reports followed over the next few years. I've credited Aldi Mackey's sighting as being the one which really kicked off Nessie fever, but co-credit does need to go to George Spicer. Aldi's was the first reported sighting in April 1933, but Spicer's sighting of the 22nd of July of the same year, and reported again by the Courier on the 4th of August, really kicked off the interest. Before then, it was really only confined to local papers and residential chatter, but after Spicer's report and the official naming of it as the Loch Ness Monster, it became national news. In a letter to the Courier, Spicer stated that he saw the nearest approach to a dragon or prehistoric animal that I have ever seen in my life, claiming it crossed the road about 50 yards in front of his car with some small animal in its mouth. He claims it had a long neck that moved up and down in the manner of a scenic railway, with a big body and a high back. He guesses that the feet were webbed, but he's not sure whether he saw anything or not because he just says if there were any feet, and he didn't notice if it had a tail or not because it was moving so quickly. He also says it was between 6 to 8 feet long. I don't know if Spicer was trying to capitalise on the monster interest, but at the same time pretend he was an indifferent skeptic or whatever, but he also described the beast as very ugly and even says, whatever it is, I think it should be destroyed. He also said that even if he was closer to it, he probably wouldn't have tried tackling it. And I do like the idea of this guy thinking he can straight up rugby tackle a massive plesiosaur. That picture, by the way, comes from an article Spicer did for the now defunct Daily Sketch newspaper in December of the same year that featured the subtitle "It Haunts Me Still" and is basically a 1930s version of those grotty tabloids that have stories like "Impregnated by My Brother's Ghost" or "Help My Dog's Addicted to Mayonnaise" and all that other mad stuff. So clearly by the end of 1933, reputable newspapers didn't really care for George and his story anymore. Also, the clippings I was able to find of the Courier printing George's letter don't seem to have a byline, but I would not at all be surprised if it turned out to be Alex Campbell again. In 2013, Columbia University, alongside notorious skeptic Daniel Loxton, actually did some research into Spicer's claim, and they deduced that Spicer and other claims of a plesiosaur-like creature in the loch at the time was due to the fact that King Kong was playing in cinemas. The film also features a long-necked, humpbacked lake creature, so they decided that the locals just really liked the film and started either seeing the creature as some sort of mass delusion or pretending there was one due to a mass appreciation of cinema. It doesn't explain why nobody reported similar creatures in another lake anywhere else in the world, considering that Kong was in cinemas globally, or why the locals of the Ness region also didn't claim they saw a giant ape in the woods, but sure, okay, fine, whatever. Now we move from Spicer to Spicy, because we're getting some pictures of Nessie. In November 1933, a man named Hugh Gray was out walking his dog around the loch and took this photograph of what he believes to be the monster. Naturally, people assumed the picture was probably a dog, or a swan, or something, or the prevailing opinion that it was an otter. British zoologist Maurice Burton apparently acquired the contact positives from the original negative of the photo, which has since been lost, and he projected them onto a screen, showing that it was just an otter rolling about. That's never actually been shown as far as I can tell, he just said it in his book. was specifically written to debunk the Loch Ness Monster. So the proof we have that this is a photo of an otter is from a guy who made a living saying that Nessie wasn't real, going, "Trust me guys, it's an otter, I've seen it, don't look any further into it, I know." Burton also weighed in to examine the next major reported sighting of Nessie. In January 1934, a man named Arthur Grant was on his motorbike at the north end of the loch when he claims he almost hit the creature while driving. Grant was a veterinary student and said it had a small head attached to a long neck and looked like a cross between a seal and a plesiosaur. He ran down to the loch to try and see it closer, but only saw ripples. Grant actually drew a sketch of what he saw, which I will flash on screen in a moment. Burton had a look at the sketch and in true Maurice Burton fashion said, "Nah mate, that's obviously an otter." This is the sketch Grant provided. Considering that Burton said this was consistent with the appearance of an otter, it makes you wonder if Maurice Burton actually knew what an otter looked like. Funny story about Maurice Burton. So in the 1960s it became quite a serious debate amongst the scientific community as to whether Nessie could possibly exist or not. One of those in the real camp was Dennis Tucker, who very briefly served as chief scientist at the National History Museum. When Burton wrote his initial Nessie is fake story for an issue of New Scientist magazine, Tucker wrote to the magazine to have a go at him. Then Burton wrote a letter back, having a go at Tucker, and so on and so forth. So for several issues of New Scientist magazine, the letters page basically descended into these two throwing crap at each other for months. It was actually quite funny. Not that funny for Tucker, who was sacked because of this, something that wasn't actually revealed to the public until some released documents came about in 2022. The next sighting, and the last one from the 1930s thank God, is the highly famous Surgeon's photograph. The one that is always used when pointing out photographic evidence that the monster does exist. It's called the Surgeon's photograph because it was allegedly taken by surgeon and gynecologist Robert Wilson, but he didn't want to have his name assigned to it due to the potential fallout with the British Medical Association. Despite getting his name taken out of the limelight, the BMA still found out about it, and they fined him due to it being a breach of professional ethics. I assume because he must have been the Loch Ness Monster's gynecologist, and it was a breach of doctor-patient confidentiality. Anyway, the story goes that Wilson was out fishing with his friend Maurice Chambers and took several photographs. When he went to a chemist in Inverness to have the plates developed, this photo was one of them, and he sent it into the Daily Mail for a £100 prize, which in today's money is about £6,000. Naturally, the picture was scrutinised into oblivion, but it was only when Chambers died in 1994 and his personal papers were looked through that it was revealed that both Wilson and Chambers were part of a larger group of men who just wanted to play a practical joke. The photo had actually been taken by Marmaduke Wetherell, a British South African actor and big game hunter. He and his son-in-law Christian Sperling devised this idea, so they bought a toy submarine, and Christian, being a sculptor, used wood putty to make the neck and head and the bit of body at the back. They made Wilson the frontman of their operation because he liked to laugh and he was the most credible person in the group. Apparently, Wetherell had wanted to do this because in 1933 he'd done another hoax at Loch Ness using a stuffed hippopotamus foot to create the monster's footprints. Wetherell worked for the Daily Mail at the time and they publicly ridiculed him when it was discovered that he'd faked it. So he wanted revenge, and to be fair, shafting them out of £6,000 is pretty decent revenge. Also, guess who weighed in on having a look at this picture? Correct, Maurice Burton. And guess what he thought it was a picture of? Correct, an otter. Given this picture was of an object that was specifically made to look like the Loch Ness Monster, and clearly does look like the Loch Ness Monster, it means that while we can't categorically say whether the Loch Ness Monster exists or not, we can without doubt agree that Maurice Burton had no idea what an otter looked like. We're going to skip ahead a bit on sightings now. There were some things that cropped up, like a short film strip that is clearly a piece of driftwood, a chief constable saying that the monster 100% exists, big up William Fraser, and a scattering of other photographs, sightings and some dodgy sonar readings. The next person I want to discuss is Tim Dinsdale. And before we go into his footage and expeditions and the like, it needs to be said that this guy was a legend in the cryptozoology world. It's often remarked on how dedicated, thorough and open to feedback Dinsdale was in his life-consuming search for proof of the monster. And even Ronald Binns, while also dedicating a chapter to discrediting him, only seems to have nice things to say about him, calling him a man of great sincerity, and his passionate devotion to the cause has been without parallel. Contrast that to when he says Alex Campbell's role in the birth and evolution of the Loch Ness mystery needs to be regarded with extreme caution. Tim Dinsdale was an aeronautical engineer who had an insane life story before he even decided to become a Nessie expert. He was born in Wales, but his parents were on leave from his dad's job in China, so he swiftly moved back to China as a boy. Then when he was 10, he was on a ship that got captured by pirates, and he then wrote an account about it that won him second prize in a newspaper competition. God knows what the kid who won first prize went through. He volunteered for the Home Guards. While he was there, he got shot in the hand, and the bullet was left there until it was removed 28 years later. He went on to train as an Air Force pilot, but the war finished before he got a chance to see combat, and he then went on to be an engineer, before being made redundant in 1962 and becoming self-employed so he could take whatever time off he wanted to go chasing Nessie. On the 21st of February 1959, Everybody magazine published an article called "The Day I Saw the Loch Ness Monster," and Dinsdale read it and immediately became obsessed with the idea of the creature, spending months poring over every sighting he could find information on. He's quoted with saying, "I could scarcely believe it, because it was like proving a unicorn existed, and yet I could not doubt the truth of what I had read." And he determined it was real before he even took a trip to visit the loch. The following spring, he did take a trip, spending a week exploring and filming to no avail. It was only on the last morning, having rigged his camera up in the passenger seat of his car to film the loch as he drove along, that what became known as the Dinsdale film was captured. The film is a bit pants, to be honest, but you can just about make out something travelling quickly across the loch and changing course slightly halfway through, though it's hard to say exactly what it could be. Dinsdale was obviously very excited, having spent the last few days witnessing the monster but never being able to capture a decent image of it. We're saying this is decent, I suppose. A few years later, some RAF photographic experts in the Joint Air Reconnaissance Intelligence Centre analysed the film and determined it was probably an animate object. Not the most useful conclusion, since it's obviously an object and it's obviously moving. So it's like looking at a picture of a bird and concluding, we've consulted with some experts and can state that it most probably definitely is, I think, might be a bird. That being said, the official analysis and report from the RAF was enough for the pro-Nessie flock to proclaim this was the first proper, tangible evidence of the monster, and it catapulted Dinsdale into the top echelons of Nessie expertise. It also kicked off the Loch Ness Phenomena Investigation Bureau, a decade-long series of expeditions that were led on 2 occasions by Dinsdale himself. Our very best friend in the world, Maurice Burton, naturally had an opinion on the Dinsdale film, but in a surprising twist of events, he doesn't claim the footage was of an otter. Instead, he goes with the much more scientific blob, stating the shape was unidentifiable and could have just been a bunch of men on a dinghy. This might have been due to the relationship that Dinsdale and Burton shared. Following some analysis Dinsdale did on the surgeon's photograph, which he sent to Burton, the latter remarked that it was quite competent analysis, and was even starting to come around to thinking it was genuine. The Dinsdale film was even recorded on a camera that Dinsdale had borrowed from Burton. Unfortunately, while Dinsdale became all famous for his video, it seems Burton not being made famous led to him turning face and becoming utterly invested in debunking the monster wherever possible, even writing "the elusive monster" as evidence that he had debunked it. So even though Burton had no love lost for Dinsdale, maybe he still harboured enough feelings to say that Dinsdale film was, you can't really tell what it is, rather than his otherwise scathing, "It's an otter, you idiot," that everyone else got. The next major image was Anthony Doc Shields' photograph, Alarm bells already ring about this picture because the man was a self-claimed psychic who said he summoned the monster out of the water. But then you look at the image and you can see why it's dubbed the Loch Ness Muppet, because of how hilariously fake it looks. One of the major points people make is the lack of ripples, meaning either the monster was standing entirely on the longest tiptoes in the world, or it's a toy dinosaur that Shields just plopped into the water. Why we need to look at the ripples and try and scientifically analyse this is, well, you know, thorough. We gotta be thorough, haven't we? Next, we jump into the new millennium with amateur scientist Gordon Holmes and his 2007 video of the monster. Similar to the Dinsdale film, it captures something moving quickly along the water's surface. And despite the 40-year span of technological improvements, the film is as hard to make out as Dinsdale's was. And I'm sure if the RAF had a pop at analysing it, they'd give us some gem like, our experts all agree this 100% maybe, I'm not sure, but there's a chance it could possibly be something in the water. That said, analysis has been done on the video, looking at things such as the wind direction at the time, how the object moves against the prevailing waves, and of course the shape and size of the wake. One interesting thing is that the full footage also shows a second similar disturbance close to the one that Holmes zooms in on. Theories range from things like a small water devil whirlwind causing a disturbance in the water, through to swimming creatures, even though they leave a much different wake. By this point, unfortunately, Maurice Burton had been dead for 15 years, but thankfully local marine biologist and wizard Adrian Shine was on hand to tell STV that it was an otter, although he did say, or a seal, or a water bird, so slightly more imaginative than Burton. Thanks to the rise in personal cameras as well as advanced photo manipulation programs, the sightings and hoaxes have flown thick and fast over the last decade and a half. Some notable ones include captain of the Nessie Hunter 4 boat George Edwards, who shared a picture in 2011 that he later admitted was fake, having already said he'd faked one in 1986 but now insists that that one was real. To be fair to Edwards, he was quoted as saying the monster is Loch Ness, and he did it to continue to drive enthusiasm for the monster story and keep that tourism economy healthy. In 2014, it looked like Apple Maps had managed to capture a picture of the monster, but when you look at the image, it is clearly just a boat and the lighting has been tweaked a little. And even if it was the monster, it is inconsistent with the physiology of prior Nessie sightings, so it's a different monster entirely, or it could be an otter. In fact, modern sightings have become so ubiquitous that there is a website called the official Loch Ness Monster Sightings Register, where people can submit their own sightings to be featured on the site. At time of recording, it says there are 1,157 sightings captured, though only 17, I think, from 2021 onwards. So, if the Loch Ness Monster does exist, and it definitely does, then what exactly is it? One of the major theories of Nessie is that it is a Plesiosaur. These were sea creatures that lived at the same time as the dinosaurs, though paleontologists get all arsey if you call them dinosaurs, despite them being massive reptile-adjacent creatures that lived during the Triassic period and beyond. Because apparently only the land-based ones are allowed to be called dinosaurs. There are a lot of reasons why it's widely thought that Nessie couldn't be a plesiosaur. One of these reasons is that plesiosaurs were long thought to be ocean-based creatures, and with Loch Ness being a freshwater lake, the plesiosaur couldn't survive there. You know, despite scientists being almost 100% agreed that evolution exists and creatures learn to adapt to new environments, but okay, whatever, pick and choose I guess. This was all undone in July 2022 when a group of researchers in Morocco found plesiosaur fossils in the ancient beds of what were once, millions of years ago, freshwater rivers. This led to a spark in theorists claiming that this discovery put to bed the notion of it being impossible, because now we can assume that some form of plesiosaur could survive in fresh water, particularly since Morocco, back in the days of Pangaea, was reasonably far from the ocean, so it's not like the plesiosaurs could have accidentally ended up in the freshwater river. It was a long way for them to travel. Of course, experts have pointed out that the freshwater debate isn't the only explanation. Plesiosaurs didn't have the neck strength to poke their heads out of the water like Nessie does. Loch Ness just doesn't have the resources for a family of these massive reptiles to survive. And probably most crucially, the formation of Loch Ness and the last fossil evidence of plesiosaurs miss each other chronologically by about 66 million years. On that last point, the accepted evidence for plesiosaurs is that they disappeared at the same time as the dinosaurs did, following the Cretaceous Tertiary extinction event when the asteroid wiped out 3/4 of life on Earth. Some people have pointed out that water-based creatures fared better than land-based ones, citing crocodiles, sharks and sea turtles as examples, and so point out that plesiosaurs, as well as things like megalodons, could still exist. Others would point out that everyone knows crocodiles, sharks and sea turtles still exist because we've seen them, and they're all a little bit smaller than plesiosaurs were. If they were still alive, you'd think we'd have seen one by now, maybe even in a freshwater Scottish lake. After this freshwater plesiosaur discovery was announced, Vice.com's motherboard page reached out to a paleontologist at Bath University, Nick Longrick, for his thoughts on the matter. He mentioned that the only lake with its own marine species is Lake Baikal in Siberia, which is 500 times bigger than Loch Ness. And then he said Loch Ness probably couldn't hold more than a few plesiosaurs, which I think is entirely enough to keep the lineage going and makes them inbred enough to have evolved the ability to lift their head out of the water. Monster's real, case closed. Bath University have confirmed it, let's go out. I have to say at this point, if it isn't immediately obvious, my determined and stubborn belief in Nessie is clearly me being a bit facetious, but seriously, if we can't believe that the Loch Ness Monster is real, then all of our fascination in cryptids is for nothing, right? Another popular theory with a lot of traction is that it's just a series of hoaxes. Obviously, we've had some self-admitted hoaxes like the surgeon's photograph and the ones taken by George Edwards, depending on which one he decides is fake at the minute, and obviously daft lad Marmaduke Weatherall making a fake footprint using a stuffed hippo's foot. But also, people have purposefully created hoaxes over the years, such as some people throwing amended animal corpses into the loch to mess with people, documentary teams creating animatronics to convince people it was real, and even one case where a guy found a fake fossil that someone must have buried there God knows when, just to mess with them. It stands to reason that maybe loads of people have been putting fake Nessies in there just for laughs. Maybe locals who go and grab one out of the shed every time they see some dude with the camera show up. On the subject of objects, another widely accepted theory is a lot of the black shape moving in the water sightings where a visible head and neck poking out of the water aren't seen could just be people seeing driftwood or fallen trees or other detritus that's just floating about in the loch. Or, and hear me out because this is a pretty out there theory, could be an otter. Whatever it is, sightings continue to be reported, theories continue to be proposed, research continues to be undertaken, and the legend of the Loch Ness Monster continues to endure. So, that concludes my summary of the rise and fame of the Loch Ness Monster. Most of the information I got about the early eyewitness sightings, the debunking and the pranks, etc., at least as far as the 1980s, were from two books. The first, which is more pro-Nessie, is The Loch Ness Monster and Others by Rupert Gould. And the second, which is more anti-Nessie, is The Loch Ness Mystery Solved by Ronald Binns. Both are available to read for free on the Internet Archive if you fancy exploring the stories in more depth, or if you want to shell out a large sum of money for the original prints, you can do that too. Naturally, it's up to you whether you choose to believe in Nessie or not, but as I always say, a world bereft of magic and mystery is a boring world to live in. Stay safe, stay sane, and have a good one.